There we go. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in the series on asylum and immigration. We're delighted to have Nathan McConnell along this evening. He is a minister in a church in Dundee, but he can tell you a bit more about his work there and has worked a lot with asylum seekers in the community to welcome them into the community and into his church. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Nathan this evening. A short presentation, and then there'll be a bit of time at the end, hopefully, for a bit of discussion and questions if anyone has anything. The chat is open if anybody wants to ask any questions, and we can put them to Nathan at the end. So, I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Shona. It's good to be with you tonight. It's an honor to be here. I'm so pleased to be part of Logos and just seeing what God is doing through the ministry. So thank you so very much. Just a little bit of background on me. I am the minister of Downfield Mains Church of Scotland in Dundee on the north side of the city. And I come to that role via South Florida, where I actually taught at Palm Beach Atlantic University and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in their South Florida branch. And so I spent a lot of time in ministry. It's been 25 years. And just to kind of come to some of these conclusions, I have a PhD. I hold a PhD from the University of Aberdeen. Hi, Katie. It's nice to see you on. Um, and I came by that in a roundabout way. I spent a little bit of time at Palm Beach Atlantic University taking students every summer to work in refugee camps on the island of Malta and began seeing some discrepancies in how the refugees not only were treated, but how the process to enter the EU was quite convoluted and confusing and really designed to keep people out. And so that was 2012 through 2015, and I ended up with a PhD project that actually led me into migration. So I want to do a few things. First and foremost, I want to start with a bit of discussion on the design of the political theology behind it, because oftentimes we come to migration without really understanding what we're talking about when we say asylum seeker or when we say refugee. I want to give a few definitions, and then in the second kind of half, maybe just 15 minutes, swing into what it means for your church and what it means to the church. I spent a lot of time at the beginning of 2021, I believe, no, 2022, dealing with refugees from the Ukraine. And so I want to take a little bit of time to kind of discuss that. But first thing I want to do is I want to share with you something, and I'll see if I can get it shared. It's possible. Um, and I'll see what I can do. So now all of a sudden, I'm not sure what I can do. Let's see if we can do this. Does it work? No. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I am not being successful with sharing you a PowerPoint presentation, but I would love to see if I can get it. Let me see. In system settings. Sorry, guys. Apologies. I thought it was going to come right through. Um, right. Well, why don't I do this? I will chat with you through it because obviously it's not coming up, but I want to share a few things with you. And I think those things, as the PowerPoint reinstalls, would be good. First and foremost, I want to ask a question, I suppose. Why why migration? Why do we deal with migration? And this might be, why do people migrate? I mean, that's a huge question. And I think if we step back in history, we'll understand that people have always migrated. It's not something new. It's not something that we're dealing with for the first time. And so when we ask the question, why migration? A lot of times we'll come with presuppositions, thoughts, ideas on why people migrate. And I would say this right from the beginning, it's very difficult to understand why people migrate. I mean, some things are very explanatory, self-explanatory. A war breaks out, but other things are much more complicated. And I think my thing has come up, so let's see if we can share it. Um, I'll do my best. Nope, it's not allowing me to do it. So what I want to do is I'm gonna walk through what I was going to share with you. Why do people migrate? And I think this is the complexity that we come to in this modern world, that there are contemporary patterns and trends which really form the current phenomena. We know some of them, like I said, war, famine, displacement, but there's a lot to be said for economics. There's climate variations, even family time ties and wants, what people want, where they want to live. So the answer is not as simple as just people are forced to move. And that leads me to some questions about what the categories of migration are. And I want to break down three categories for you that we talk about often when we talk about migration. One is macro um, migration, which is transnationalism. This deals with governments and states, like the Scottish government, the UK government, the EU, all have these. They fall under the category of macro. So these are the bigger discussions that have huge implications, like the Rwanda scheme, like how we absorb those coming from the Arab Spring, the Syrians, um, the Ukrainians coming through the Homes for Ukraine scheme. These are macro and transnational questions. The Schengen Agreement, the various ways in which governments work together to try to figure out how migrants move. The second is micro migration, individual causation. I want a better life. How many people have we heard say that before? These things are often linked with family, finding a job for an individual, entering into a community, but it's really a drive by an individual to move and want a better life. I know for me, as a migrant, I moved to Scotland. The Church of Scotland offered me a post, and I said, "Praise the Lord!" And it was an opportunity. I wanted to experience what God was doing there, and so I moved. So I fall into the category of micro migration. The third that's less talked about is the MISO. And it's literally individuals or collective agencies. These are the places where migrants hang out. How many of us have seen migrants sitting in a cafe? We see migrants and people who've entered into our communities. They've moved into the places of worship. They become part of our faith communities. We see them in the shops. We begin to hear their language. We begin to understand that they're around us. And there are also professional advocating services, well, lawyers and various collective agencies that push to keep and retain and integrate those who come into a community. So these three categories kind of play a role in how we kind of approach migration. So if I was talking to the Scottish government, which I have in the past, especially when it came to the Homes for Ukraine scheme, um, this would be larger discussions around the macro. Now, the definitions become important for us, and this is really important. And I want to just share a few definitions as we kind of proceed forward. First is illegal migrant. How many of you have heard that? You've heard that phrase, illegal migrant. It's very common in the media, and it has implications. And I think this is really important for us to understand that sometimes it will be poised or posed as a regular migration, someone who's kind of come in to a system. But we need to remember that once you cross a border into a country that you're no longer entitled to reside in, you are known in the system as illegal. And that might be debated, that might be discussed. There will have different visions on either side. People will have very emotive opinions about it. But from a legal standpoint, you become illegal once you cross the border into a place you're not legally entitled to be in. The next is refugee. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, defines a refugee as someone who is outside their country of origin and is unable or unwilling to return due to a fear of persecution. This could be religious, this could be social, this could be societal, you name it, political. But there is a distinct fear of persecution which guides that definition. Asylum seeker is someone who intends to seek or is awaiting a decision on their request for international protection. So everyone enters in as a refugee. They become an asylum seeker when they choose to enter the process for a decision or a request for that protection. These often get jumbled up when you're discussing certain things, and sometimes you have to say, well, when I'm discussing asylum seeker, I'm actually meaning refugee, or at times asylum seeker becomes a kind of an umbrella or a catch-all for these other definitions, and that's not always the case either. Um, the other one is economic migrant. At times, an economic migrant will be required to fulfill states' labor market demands. There's a shortage of workers, and therefore the doors open up. But this is a very different than a regular migrant who has come to work for a period of time. And so we need to keep those kind of those definitions pretty clear. The other one, which we all know of, is a forced migrant. For example, those who are fleeing the Ukrainian crisis and the war. They're fleeing their homes for reasons outside their control. It's involuntary and usually requires a very important specific designation. I was very pleased with the way the UK government responded to the Ukrainian crisis when it happened. I think all of us responded quite well. Um, and even in the process over the last number of years, it's been good to watch how cities like Dundee, my own city, has actually responded quite well. Um, but yeah, so I want to share those definitions. I think those are important. I'm more than happy to send you this PowerPoint so you can actually have it and you can look at them over in the time because I realize you're probably not catching it all. But I do want to share a few things, right? The politics of migration, the macro, territorial entities have been the thrust, modern borders, national sovereignty, transnational understandings, allegiances, the Dublin III regulation, Schengen. We all have heard these things. As we came out of with Brexit, and Brexit pulled us out of some of these agreements. There's been continual talk of renegotiations and what that's going to look like. I did a recording for Trans World Radio about Starmer's new policy of attempting to tackle the gangs in far away from us in Eastern Europe. That these type of conversations are macro conversations, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions about that type of discussion. The second is this: that once people cross a border, um, they end up in a state of exception. And I think that's really important. Some of my work on my PhD was on a man named Giorgio Agamben, who coined this state of exception, the gap within governmental law where people reside. It's the exception is the space where the judicial order in nation states is set aside when needed. Governments have the capacity under their sovereign state to set aside law and thus suspend migrants oftentimes. And this is really important for us as we advocate as Christians for those specific individuals. Um, this allows governments to essentially bypass law or suspend law for the sake of their own specific purposes. And this is called the state of exception. And it's pretty well known that this is how governments work. And what are they doing? Well, they're suspending people. And that's the most important thing we need to remember. Um, Agamben talks a lot about the homo sacer, the sacred human, where it's classified, where the human is put into a classification. The classical world observed life in two ways, both as sacred, that is life that's given to the human, which is delineated as Zoe, natural reproductive life without political freedom, and the bios, the political life of the human. Slaves, for example, in the classical world, came under that quasi-political status of Zoe, the quasi designation that has been adopted in modernity. Societies have humans living with this kind of designation. They're always in the midst. We know them to be refugees. They have a quasi-political reality, but they're not quite fully there. And I think we could all kind of agree and maybe we've seen this in the past. And this type of philosophy actually hinders the level to which refugees matriculate into society. Are they able to go further? Are they not? Are they able to fully become part of the political sphere? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Usually, if it's no, then you'll see a further move of that person. I know when I was in Malta, the heart's desire was that everybody would get to Italy. And you can't imagine how devastated they were to end up being taken to Malta because once they arrived in Malta, their fingerprint became their national identity. And so Malta became their home of repatriation. And that right there put them into this place of quandary where they couldn't move forward, they couldn't go backwards. They were essentially suspended by the law in a sovereign exemption. And so this leaves people abandoned. According to sovereign exception, the law applies to him by no longer applying. What do we do with these people? Is there really a law for them? Is there really? And you'll see political entities begin to fight and argue. And I want to say that this is what leads to borders, or how does the ban actually take shape? It takes shape with borders, detention, quarantine. Quarantine comes from the word quarente, which literally is the Latin word for four. It's where we get the concept of four walls. Um, and when I don't know if you enjoyed quarantine when we were in lockdown. Did you enjoy that? Please, everybody, raise your hand. Oh, it was so wonderful. But we literally lived it out that we were stuck in quarantine. There are other things that ban people, passports, visas, things that maybe we take for granted when we get on the plane. Not everybody gets those. Not everybody has access to those. And if they do, they're limited. And so there's lots of ways in which people have a hard time moving forward. And I think it's really important that when you look at borders and you look at detention, many of the young men that I dealt with had 150 in a small room in Malta. They were locked in for sometimes 6 months without ever seeing the sky. They struggled. Many men actually committed suicide after they were taken out. Why? Because the hope had been gone. Their future had been gone, and they couldn't see going forward, and they certainly couldn't go backwards. And so sometimes these bans are something that needs to be challenged. And I think that's where the Christian voice, and I would say this, then asking the question, how should the faith community respond? Use your voice, speak up, um, and exemplify practices that Christians should exemplify, meaning receive well people who come into your midst, figure out ways to truly minister to them. You'll notice, I don't know about you, but when I first moved here, I had to apply for something. It was called a national insurance number. How many of you have one of those? Um, that's how governments keep track of us. Technically, we're known as a number. And I realized the other day I had to do something for the United States, and I had to put in a social security number. And I realized, oh, they're tracking me by my number status. And if you think about the way the community of faith moves, is we don't look at numbers. You're not known as a number. I was doing some military training this last week down in outside London, and I was wearing a bib, and I was known as number 26, and nobody called me a name. And I realized very quickly that's the reality of our lives. That sometimes from a governmental perspective, we're known as a number, and this is why governments cannot truly do good ministry to those who are coming in. They need the church, and we need to use our voice to actually speak life into the church, from the church into the power. I spoke this last weekend on some of the political things that are going on in the United Kingdom from my pulpit. And there's still a responsibility for all of us to speak truth to power. Why? Because we advocate. Jesus Christ is the great advocate, and therefore we advocate. He's a great high priest. And I want to say this. I want to quote something to you from Susanna Schneider. Susanna is at Oxford University. When it comes to voicing the inclusion of people, she says churches have an inescapably political role and political engagement, which takes a variety of forms, from publishing responses to the government, white papers, to awareness, to raising awareness and lobbying. And all of these things matter. because oftentimes we have the voice, we have the language to be able to speak for those individuals. And advocating is huge. And for those on the move, I'll give you three P advocatings. One is political advocating, writing, communicating for your MSPs, your MPs, the BIOS life, that need to advocate because they're unable to do it. So we do it for them. The second P is presence or personal advocating, opening your home and inviting someone to dinner, getting coffee, teaching one-to-one ESL languages, which we did at our church, and which still takes shape today. I noticed the other day, so we have a number of refugees who are still getting one-to-one lessons in English all these years later. Remember that the Zoe is still a sacred person, right? God made man in his image. And we often talk about the Imago Day, but Jesus was very clear that I've come to give you life, Zoe. How about the priestly advocating? This is where the church comes in. Jesus says, I've come to give you life, Zoe, right? Creating church spaces where migrants and refugees can flourish, irrespective of classification. Let's be reminded, our job is not to classify them. Our job is to receive them, to love them, just as Christ would. Sunday services. When we do our Sunday services, and there's a good number of Ukrainians, I call my friends in Ukraine. I had the privilege of starting 3 churches in the Ukraine in the early 2000s. And I call them and say, hey, will you record a 5-minute message of the gospel for my congregation? And they'll record it in Ukraine, send it to us, and we'll share it during our services. And it's fun to watch the older people in my congregation just smile the moment that Ukrainian is being spoken. And it creates a bond between those who come into the church and those even from without. Alpha courses, ESL, Homes for Ukraine scheme. I had Natasha and Olena living with us for a year, um, and my daughters. So the manse was packed. And it was amazing. And it was fun to have them here. And over the course of a year, we had the privilege of actually seeing them come into a different home. We put them into a flat. We got them into their schooling. And this was happening throughout the city. And so priestly advocating continuously. We have started a choir where we now have like 5 languages, 5 different people groups in Dundee. Dundee, yeah. And and it's a children's choir. It's a soul choir. It's about Jesus. And everybody seems to like it. And I look at even my Muslim children who have, I don't say them, they're not my Muslim children, but the children who come who have their full-on burqas on and they're there singing about Jesus. I just love that. I just amazing. Um, Finding them houses, Christmas hampers, gift cards. One of the things that we've really worked hard to do is stay, and I know many people do, is work with the local refugee council for asylum seekers. All of these things, from political advocating to presence to personal advocating to priestly advocating, they matter. And I know this is short, but I just I want to say this, that at this point in time, yes, all of those definitions matter. And I think for our ignorance, oftentimes we talk about migration and we don't really know what we're talking about. So I think it's very important for people to actually just get a baseline. I think that's really important. But at the same time, we need to voice and we need to practice. And that's gonna cost us something. It's gonna mean sacrifice. It's gonna mean you have to do something. And yeah, you're gonna have to step outside your comfort zone. When the war broke out in Ukraine, we had not been allowed to use our church sanctuary for a very long time, and it was very, very cold, but it was useful. And so we opened it up, and we put out the word that we were going to take uh, some supplies to the Ukraine. And from there, what we found is people brought 7 feet high of various different goods. We had medical supplies donated. And I literally said, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. What are we going to do? How are we going to get this stuff to the Ukraine, but we ended up having drivers and vans, and we took it. And what it did is it brought the community together. So many people came. We had hundreds of volunteers at the church, and that's just one aspect to it. On day one, I had someone from America call me and say, "I want to donate $20,000 to the Ukrainian Relief Fund," and so I gave all that money away quite quickly, and I can't give it away fast enough. We now have close to the same amount, and I cannot seem to give it away fast enough. So the moment that we give, and so there are lessons for our congregations that are very clear. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Our goal is just to keep pouring into the life of the people around us. Um, and that may sound like we don't pour into the people around us in our local community. Yes, everyone gets poured into. But when it comes to refugees and migrants, especially in the context of the Ukrainian conflict, there's still a lot to be done. And in my mind, I think, who's going to rebuild after all of this stuff gets sorted? So there's still things running through there. I think that's probably enough information. You probably, that was a data dump. I'll ask, do you have any questions? You might have them in the group. You could throw them in. You could feel free to ask openly, whatever. But I'd be more than happy to talk through, or maybe you didn't catch something, but I'd love to chat it through with you.
Are there any, just a quick question from me, is there any kind of practical things that you think churches could be doing more of in their own communities if they have asylum seekers kind of arrive and move in? What are the kind of practical things that churches can do in order to help them settle in and become part of the community?
Yeah. Key, key first, suppose learning the framework and the system by which people come into the country is key. For example, the moment that people arrive, they typically will end up in the council. And so making sure that you have relationships with those in the council. At the same time, throwing out English language lessons on all the various simple things that we think are very simple, um, opening up a door of opportunity. I know for us, one of the key moments for us in ministry was that we helped come alongside and definitely get people into college. That was a big deal. They wanted to go to English language lessons and they wanted to get to college. So we helped get people into the college. We took them over there. We would sit with them. We get them serviced. So there's little practical things, but it's literally opening your eyes to find the need and then actually just going and doing it, I think, Shona. And no one size fits all. You might be in a rural community and you'll come up with a wholly different idea that's needed, but actually keeping your eyes open to say, there's something here that could take shape. Um, and not saying, well, this is the only way that it can get done. Because quite frankly, there's so many different ways and so many different opportunities that you could come up with. But having a heart for people, I think, is key. I know a lot of churches, you know, eh, they have a hard time welcoming even people from their own community, let alone people from out with their community. And I think it's key to just keep an open heart. I have always desired in my own heart, in my own ministry, that I would have every tongue, tribe, and nation there. So what has happened is we have pursued to have every tongue, tribe, and nation. And so on a Sunday, you might find Ukrainians, you might find Northern Irish, you might find Scots and Americans, you might find Nigerians in our congregation with the goal and the express goal of bringing glory and honor to God, but really loving each other, loving Him, and then loving each other well. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. I'm taking chair's prerogative and going first with my questions, but happy to open it up if anyone else has any questions or thoughts or just comments to make with Nathan. Having Nathan here is a real privilege, and it's great to talk to somebody who has so much experience and knowledge on the topic. So I'm quite happy to see if anybody else wants to come in with questions.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, hi.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, hi. It was just to kind of agree with Nathan, just really about to highlight how far just fundamental friendship can go, and just the nuts and bolts of being friends with people. And I wrote down about not categorizing and making a kind of another us and them. At the end of the day, we just share common humanity. We run a wee cafe which offers English language support for anybody, but we've found that it's mainly populated by refugees. And recently we had an enormous number of young men from Sudan and Eritrea, who all came in a group. Apparently 125 of them arrived in Dundee all at once. Is my sound okay? My computer's saying my
Yep.
audio quality is not good.
You're okay.
That's fine. So anyway, we open our little cafe and we offer help with English language, conversational, or we've got ESOL teachers, all sorts of levels we offer. But there just is an enormous resource in ordinary friendship and the offer of hospitality, which goes really well beyond the boundaries of an English-speaking cafe. And certainly the feedback we've had is that, particularly these young men who've come from deeply traumatized circumstances, many of them from Sudan, where their homes have been shot to bits. They don't know if their families are still alive. They can't communicate with their families because the internet doesn't work there anymore. And they have said they can't really put into words what it means just to have a kind conversation over a cup of coffee, because their experiences in Europe have been so traumatic. Being beaten up by police in Paris and being shoved off the beaches at Lampedusa and the British beaches, shoved back onto boats. Some of them have tried 3 times to cross the English Channel. So a cup of coffee and a kind conversation goes a very, very long way for people who've experienced that kind of trauma. So it's not complicated. We can all do it, and there's such huge resource just in true friendship, where we're just friends together.
Gosh, yeah.
Totally agree.
Very powerful. One thing that strikes me is in working with people is that have you been surprised by how much you have received? So you talk a lot about what you have given, but has what you have received surprised you?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. There's something beautiful. Yeah, we talk about what we do, but you're right. Every time that we have an interaction with somebody, or something happens, or we step out and do something, we typically have a great great joy. I'll tell you this, even last night, because oftentimes we classify refugees as though maybe they're boat people or they came across, or migrants come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms. They come in different ways. They come with different visas. They come in, sometimes they're university students, and migrants go across. So we always think about the forced migrants, or the ones who are on the move in that way. But there's other ways. And I was thinking this is very interesting. But we've started these soul choirs for these children throughout the local primary schools. So we've opened the door. And I've got one that's really going strong on the north side of the city. And I got a phone call the other day from somebody from Sri Lanka who lives in the city. And she said that she wanted her daughter to be part of a soul choir. And they're new to the nation, but they really would like to be part of a choir, which means that a lot of times the people bring their culture with them, and they have these beautiful aspects of their culture that kind of we need to take advantage of. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Well, I was on a train in England when she did it, and I kind of blew it off, to be fair, to be honest. I was like, oh, I can't really deal with that right now. So I get a WhatsApp message, and it's a little girl singing the song that I had sent. I sent a tutorial to them, and she's singing it, with her beautiful kind of, accent, and she's singing about Jesus. And at the end, I get done, and I'm just want to cry. And she said, "Would that be okay for my tryout?" And I'm thinking to myself, "You're in," And but I think taking advantage of those little moments is absolutely right, Shona. You're good to bring that up. That we need to kind of step back and say, wow, this is amazing. Even fun things like people will make borscht, and eventually you'll end up eating borscht in our kitchen, and they're having a blast in there. So you walk in and you, oh, hey, and then all of a sudden there's a party going on. And I think we need to take advantage of those moments of just and relish in them and say, wow, this is amazing. So
The best parties are always in the kitchen, in my experience.
yeah.
Anyone else want to come in? Has anyone else got comment? We have a comment in the chat. Have you any tips oh, hang on. Oh, my mouse is not working very well this evening. Practical things the church has been doing, and love the idea of not categorizing people. Have you any tips for encouraging other Christians to engage better with new Scots? I find some people still feel migrants are a threat, even in church. These conversations very quickly become heated, and I'd love to be able to have those conversations fruitfully and
Mhm.
move to action and loving our neighbours from other countries as well. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, tips on encouraging better with new Scots. I was once a new Scot. I think oftentimes we think, but I was once a new Scot. My children were new Scots. They were heavily persecuted in their schools because of their accents. And they went through it. And I think oftentimes there is that threat that people see people who are the stranger or the one who comes from the foreign place as someone who's going to steal or rob from them or take from them. And, there will always be those conversations around resources. And I think that's really important to remember that resources, when they're scarce, there's a competitive nature of all people to kind of vie for them, and that changes the way we talk about things. It changes the way we treat each other. It changes the way that migrants are treated when they come in. Um, how to better engage or just talk to them? Hey, how are you? Where are you from? I always ask the question, where you're from, because they want to tell you where they're from. They're in a socially isolated situation, and they really do want to share. So a simple question um, typically opens a good door. And if you can find some commonality, I mean, let's face it, we live in a global world. Most of us know a little bit about some nations and nations. And so if someone were to show up in Malta, they would have probably come through the Horn of Africa. And you make connections through any relationships. Oh, I know this person and this person, and oh, I met this person. But really opening the door with a question. How are you? How are you finding Scotland? Do you know how important that question really is to a migrant? Because they'll tell you, and then it opens a door. So yeah, I try to shy away. We don't have any animosity in our church actually. And I think that a lot of that is said, if I were to say this, make sure that the pastor that you have actually believes in actually loving people. Because I know there are some pastors who don't after being in ministry for almost 30 years. So they say they do, but they don't really want them around, and that's a dangerous place to be. And so I think sometimes voicing inclusion means we actually stand up for those situations as well, or stand up to those situations. We're called to be the church. We're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We're called to be those people who actually have the ability to matriculate the stranger. Why? Because we were all foreign aliens. We were alienated from the household of God, and now we're in. We've been adopted. We've been taken in, and so I think if we can get our mind around that, Kirsten, that we can actually do this better. Um, yeah, I think we'll love the neighbors well. So.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in? I have lots of questions, but I don't want to hog things. But another one that I thought about was there was obviously there was a very different reaction in communities between when the Ukrainian refugees arrived and other refugees. And I just wondered if you had sensed how did you handle that? How did your church handle that in terms of the wider community reaction between the two groups of refugees? I'm guessing you guys didn't see any difference, but or did you, and how did that work?
Are you talking about the differences between the Ukrainians and, let's say, the Syrians?
Yeah,
Or
just the way people were suddenly like so welcoming and so desperate to help and so desperate to open their homes.
yeah,
Um, but that wouldn't have been the case in terms of, Syrian refugees or Afghanistan refugees or that kind of thing.
yeah, there was I did have some unique challenges between the concept of the Afghanis and the Ukrainians. And let's be fair. Religious dialogue will always be there and biases will be there. I remember there was a point in time where I was discussing with the Church of Scotland about negotiating for old manses to actually be turned into housing. I actually almost lost my job over it. It was quite wonderful, actually. But I fought heavily and bitterly for the sake in the presbytery to refurbish a manse. And so we refurbished a manse. Katie was there. I know that we refurbished a manse, and I got in trouble for it because we didn't ask for permission. We just did it. In that instance, we put in a Ukrainian. And so I went to the government and I had some meetings with the Scottish government. And I said, wouldn't it be great if, and I negotiated on behalf of the Church of Scotland to see if we could possibly do that more and open up. There was a housing shortage and crisis, especially in Edinburgh. How could we make things happen during this amalgamation? And what I found was the Scottish government really did want to put in Afghanis, but they weren't taking into consideration the dynamics between the Christian and Muslim dialogue and the difficulties of that. And as much as we would have wanted to do as much as we could, some churches would have just said, no, we're not taking, we'll be more than happy to take Ukrainians because of our Christian background, Christian faith. We're not putting in Afghanis and because of the cultural normatives and so forth. I have no position on that, but I did see that. And that's a reality that you have to live with. It's something that we have to, as the church, we recognize that it exists. There are biases. There are times in which people will say, I don't want to deal with this group of people. Um, and it's our job to continue to just show the love of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God. Never set aside our theology or our principles and throw them away, but actually maintain that Jesus is the perfect advocate. And I would say this: we've opened the door, and I have many friends who are from Syria in this city, um, and we continue to talk. Some of them even came to our alphas during COVID. So they would come into our alpha groups, and so they've gone through alpha. Um, have they become Christians? No. Are they still friends? Absolutely. Do we still love their families? Yes. Do we still support their families? Absolutely. Um, yeah. I mean, sometimes we have to ask, what are the aims and the goals? And if it's pretty narrow, then you're not gonna fulfill the goal. So I hope that does that answer your question a bit, Shona? There are
Yeah, yeah,
dynamics.
it does. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's recognizing that there are, I think, and the recognition that there are differences, and acknowledging those is very important, and not just glossing over them.
Yeah.
Um, I think is quite important for people, and not being scared to do that, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Has anyone else got anything they want to come in with or raise or say? No, no.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
mention, I thought Katie's comment was very
Mm,
helpful, being a friend, and we had a men's barbecue a couple of years ago, and I got chatting to this chap from Iran,
Mm.
and it turned out he was an asylum seeker, and I just felt I mean, just almost a deep love for him. I just really liked him, and he started coming along to our church, became a Christian. And so it's been very logical to invite him to our home. He's been in our home a number of times, and we've become friends. And it's not I must make robotic friends with this poor asylum seeker. We've just become very good friends. And I take an incredible pleasure. I hope it doesn't trip into pride when every time I introduce him to someone, I say, "This is my friend." Dot dot dot. And it just warms my heart to be able to align myself with him and say, "This is my friend." And I once asked him when he was in our home, I knew he was an asylum seeker. I said, how did you get to the UK? In a lorry.
Mm.
and he rattled off the 14 countries that came through in a lorry. And, it's just, I have a very deep affection for this man.
Mm.
Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing. It's amazing.
Mm.
Thanks, Derek. There are going to be costs, I think, with friendship too, and sometimes I find that the people who are probably the most Pharisaical, if I can say that, are within the church at times. We had do you remember when the Iranian women were actually protesting? And I believe it was the death of that young woman. And we had a local Iranian woman who lived in the city, and we invited her to come and speak about the issue because it had come up to the year anniversary, and we invited her to come, and it was wonderful. And she spoke, and it was for my daughters, it was probably one of the most impacting services they ever had. They were so touched by this, and she spoke for about 20 minutes about the situation in Iran, and we prayed for her. She's not a Christian, but really is no friend of Islam either. And what I found after the fact is that there were a few people in our church who were very angry that they thought she had given the message, and she had stood up there as a Muslim. And I said, no, no, she didn't give the message. She talked about an issue that God cares about. He's concerned about these people. He loves these people. And I took heavy persecution even from some of the more Pharisaical folk in my church. And I think there's going to be those moments, and I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that you're going to step out and love a refugee, and somebody in the church is not going to like it. Somebody in society is not going to like it. And the question is, well, do we just hold back then and say no? Absolutely not. We fight that battle because God has called us to love our neighbor, and He's called us to be loving people. It's just part of who we are as a nature, as the nature of God in us, as the Holy Spirit resides in us. We love. God is love. And so, yeah, just know that even if you get caught in those situations, you're doing the right thing.
Great. Good. Well, I don't think anyone else wants to come in unless anyone's burning desire to speak. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much, Nathan. That was a really powerful session, and Katie as well for sharing your experiences too, and fantastic stories from what's going on in Dundee, and hopefully we can see that replicated in churches and communities across Scotland. So thank you so much for your time this evening. We'll be taking a break over Christmas in our webinars. Our next one will be in the new year, when we have Brent Haywood coming to speak to us about some of the legal challenges that are going on in the moment in the UK with around freedom of speech and human rights, and non-crime hate incidents, which I know he's also involved in. So be a really interesting session, and I will let everyone know about that when we have a date for that in the new year. So thank you all so much for coming along tonight, and every blessing, and have a nice Christmas and New Year when it comes. Good night,
Right on.
all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.